Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to take a deep dive into something I think we've all thought about. Do men feel the same pressure to settle down as women do? We always hear about the societal pressures women face to get married and have kids, but what about guys? For this deep dive, we're turning to a Reddit thread titled, "Do Men Also Get Pressured Settling Down at Certain Point?" It's on the Ask Men Advice subreddit. The original poster is basically asking, do men feel pressure to settle down because of their age, or maybe pressure from family, or even their own desires? Or do most men just feel confident and worry-free about not settling down? Have you ever felt this kind of pressure? Let's see what these guys have to say.
One thing that really jumped out right away, the vast majority of the men on this thread said yes, they absolutely do feel that pressure to settle down. It's interesting because when you think about societal expectations and traditional gender roles, it's not all that surprising. The idea of what makes a manly man often includes being a provider and being the head of a family.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of guys on the thread actually said exactly that. Like they feel pressure from their families to hurry up and get married and have kids already. There are tons of comments about parents putting on the pressure. One guy even said his parents straight up bought him engagement rings.
Wow. That's some serious pressure. It's like they skipped all the subtle hints and went straight to get married already.
Right. And it goes beyond just parents wanting grandkids. A lot of men mention that in their culture. Like, for example, Pakistani and Asian cultures. Marriage is seen as a super crucial step into adulthood and like a marker of responsibility.
Absolutely. The cultural context is huge in shaping these expectations. What's considered normal is totally different from one culture to another.
Totally. And that just adds another layer of complexity to this whole settling down thing. But here's another thing that I thought was super interesting. Some men in the thread talked about how not being married by a certain age can make them feel less manly.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it shows how much traditional gender roles still have power even today. It's like there's this invisible checklist for what makes a successful man, and getting married is a big check mark on that list.
Totally. It's like there's a script that men are expected to follow. And if they don't follow it, they risk being judged or feeling like they aren't good enough.
It's important to remember how powerful these societal scripts can be, even if they're unspoken. They can shape our desires and anxieties in ways we may not even realize.
For sure. Speaking of anxieties, another pressure point that came up a lot was FOMO, fear of missing out. One guy shared this really sad story about how his entire friend group slowly started getting married and having families, and he was left feeling totally isolated and alone.
That feeling of social isolation can be really painful, especially when you don't fit those societal expectations. Humans are social creatures. We need connection and belonging. When you see everyone around you hitting those milestones, it's normal to feel like you're falling behind, even if you aren't ready or don't want those things.
All right, it shows how settling down isn't just about finding a partner. It's also about fitting into a certain mold. But here's where things get really interesting. Not all the pressure is external. A lot of the men on this thread admitted that they actually feel an internal pressure to settle down because of their own desire to find a partner and build a family and experience that close connection.
It's not always about giving in to society's pressure. It can also be about genuinely wanting love and companionship and building your own family. Those are powerful motivators, too.
It reminds us that human motivation is complex. We're influenced by both what we want and what society expects of us. And separating those two can be tough.
It's like a tug of war between what society expects and what we truly want for ourselves.
Exactly. And that brings us to a fascinating point that a lot of men brought up, timing. It seems like men do feel pressure to settle down, but it often comes later than it does for women.
That makes sense if you think about the biological realities. Women are really aware of their biological clock ticking and the limits that puts on when they can have children. Men don't face that same pressure, at least not in the same way.
One comment even said that men get a 5 to 10-year grace period before the pressure really kicks in.
Yeah, it's like society assumes that men have more time to figure things out, focus on their careers or personal goals before they have to settle down.
Right, like they have more freedom to explore and establish themselves.
It makes you wonder, does having that extra time affect how men make decisions? Do they feel less rushed or more confident in their choices because they had that time to explore? Or does it just delay the inevitable pressure?
Those are great questions. And you know what? This thread actually gives us some clues. Because it turns out there's a whole other side to this settling down dilemma, one that flips the script completely.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, so while I was reading this thread, I came across something that made me laugh and raise an eyebrow at the same time. A subreddit called Waiting to Wed.
Waiting to weed, I have a feeling this is going to be good.
It's basically a place where women can vent their frustrations about their boyfriends who won't propose to them.
So it's like we're seeing the other side of the coin here. Women feeling the pressure to get married and taking out their frustration on their partners.
Exactly. It's like this pressure cooker is bubbling over on both sides. And you know what? A lot of the men in our Ask Men Advice thread actually pointed to this subreddit as proof that women are putting pressure on them to settle down.
Wow. It's fascinating. It's like two sides of the same coin, both feeling the pressure, but from different angles.
Totally. It makes you think, is all this pressure coming from a genuine desire for commitment and family? Or is it more about societal expectations and fear of not fitting in?
It's probably a mix of both. It just goes to show how these societal pressures can show up in different ways and sometimes even cause tension and conflict in relationships.
Absolutely. And you know what? This waiting tab wed thing gets even more complicated because some women on there are venting, but others are suggesting a simple solution. If you want to get married that bad, propose yourself.
Oh, the age-old question. Who proposes? I wonder how that went over in the thread. Well, it sounds like that simple solution actually opened up a whole can of worms about gender roles and expectations.
Yeah, it did. A lot of men pushed back hard against the idea of women proposing. Several guys said they would find it manipulating, even coercive.
That's really interesting because it suggests that even in relationships today, there are still these really deep beliefs about who should have the power and control, especially when it comes to a big decision like marriage.
It's like if a woman proposes, it challenges the man's sense of masculinity.
Exactly. It goes against all those traditional gender roles and expectations that have been around for centuries.
And it shows how traditions aren't always so simple. They're often loaded with cultural meaning and expectations. But there's another side to this waiting to wed subreddit that we have to talk about. Some of the comments got pretty dark, with women talking about manipulating their boyfriends or giving them ultimatums to try and force a proposal.
Yeah, that's never a good idea. It's understandable to feel frustrated if your partner isn't ready to get married, but using those kinds of tactics is never healthy.
It's a recipe for disaster. You can't build a happy and lasting marriage on pressure and resentment.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to communicate openly and honestly right from the start of the relationship. If marriage is a priority for you, you have to talk about it early on and make sure you and your partner are on the same page.
For sure. And speaking of those tough conversations, there's another comment from the Ask Men Advice thread that I found really insightful. One man said he decided to focus on finding a partner. Instead of focusing on his career, he ended up being successful in both. But it took him longer to get there.
That's a great example of the trade-offs that men sometimes have to make, trying to balance what society expects of them with their own goals and desires.
It's like he had to choose between freedom, the freedom to chase his career dreams, and the rewards of settling down and having a family.
It makes you wonder, what are we willing to sacrifice for love and connection and family? And are those sacrifices always worth it?
Those are big questions, and there aren't any easy answers.
Nope. Everyone has to find their own balance.
Exactly. But even when we're trying to make our own choices, societal expectations still have a lot of power.
For sure. It's like this invisible force that shapes how we think and what we do.
And one of the biggest ways those expectations influence us is through our friends and family.
Absolutely. A lot of men on the thread said that the pressure to settle down depends a lot on your environment and the people you're around. Like, for example, if you live in a big city with a lot of college-educated people, it's more common to delay marriage and focus on your career first.
It's like those environments have different norms, so it's more acceptable to break from those traditional timelines.
Exactly. What feels like a ton of pressure in one group might not be a big deal in another.
It's all about context. And then you have to think about cultural differences, too. One guy mentioned a tradition in some European countries where they jokingly shame unmarried men on their 25th birthday.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. It shows how cultural norms can shape those expectations, sometimes through humor and rituals.
Right. It makes you wonder, do those playful traditions actually influence people's behavior? Or are they just harmless fun?
Maybe they help to normalize talking about marriage, even if it's in a lighthearted way. It could make men feel more comfortable sharing their thoughts and feelings about settling down.
That's a good point. It could open up a space for dialogue without all the pressure and judgment. But sometimes the pressure isn't so lighthearted. Several guys mentioned feeling a sense of urgency, not because of society, but because they want to have kids. And they know that women's fertility declines with age.
That's a valid concern. It's a different kind of pressure, one that's tied to biology. Men who want to be fathers are facing a different kind of clock.
Right. It adds a whole other layer of complexity. It's not just about if you want to settle down. It's also about when. and how that lines up with your partner's desires and biological realities.
It shows how these decisions are rarely simple. They're influenced by so many factors, personal and biological, societal and individual.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with all these different pieces. But with all this talk about pressure and timelines, it's important to remember that not everyone feels this way. Some of the guys on the thread said they feel zero pressure to settle down. They're happy being single, and they don't care about societal expectations or biological clocks.
That's important to remember. Not everyone feels that pull towards marriage and family, and that's totally okay. Some people are happy and fulfilled without a relationship or kids.
And it's great that those voices are part of the conversation. It reminds us that there isn't just one right way to live your life. What matters is finding what feels authentic and fulfilling to you, no matter what society says.
Absolutely. That's where self-awareness is so important. It's about understanding your own values and desires and priorities and making choices that align with them, even if they go against the grain.
So it sounds like the main takeaway here is societal pressures definitely exist, but they don't have to control our choices. We can define what settling down means for us and create a life that feels right on our own terms.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those pressures, understanding where they come from, and then making conscious choices that reflect our own values and goals.
So as we look at all these different perspectives, I think we can see a clear picture emerging. Men do feel pressure to settle down, but the reasons for that pressure and when it happens can be totally different, depending on cultural background, personal desires, biological realities, societal expectations, and even the people they're surrounded by.
It's a nuanced issue with no easy answers. What makes it so interesting is how these individual stories reflect bigger societal norms and expectations about what it means to be a man, about relationships, and about the ideal life path.
It really makes us think critically about the pressures we face, both the ones from within and the ones from outside, and how they shape the choices we make.
It encourages us to question those assumptions and decide for ourselves what truly matters.
So now I want to hear from you. What really stuck out to you in this conversation? Were you surprised by anything these men said?
Did any of it resonate with you?
You know, it's always cool to see how these discussions make people think about their own lives. Maybe it even made you question some of your own assumptions about men and the pressure they face.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from cultural expectations to biological realities, from FOMO to the ups and downs of modern relationships.
And I think it all comes down to this. How much do societal expectations influence the choices we make?
Yeah, and how do we deal with those expectations in a way that feels true to ourselves?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we balance those outside pressures with what we feel inside?
It's definitely something to think about as you navigate your own life and relationships.
It's a journey, figuring out what truly matters to us and having the courage to go after it, even if it means going against what society expects.
Absolutely.
Okay, so one last thing. Remember that this deep dive was based on just one Reddit thread. What these guys said might not be true for all men, but it does give us a glimpse into the different ways that societal pressure and personal desires can clash.
It's a small but interesting look at a complex issue that people don't talk about enough.
So now we want to hear from you. Does this sound familiar? Have you experienced this kind of pressure yourself or seen it in the men in your life? Share your thoughts with us.
And until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep those conversations going.
Thanks for joining us.